There's a moment, and if you've ever cared about someone else's child, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. There's a moment when a kid looks at you with those completely unfiltered eyes, and they ask you something so honest, so raw, that every carefully constructed version of yourself just collapses. Mine came on a Tuesday afternoon in early March. I was standing in Alora's kitchen, the kind of kitchen that tells you everything about a person: mismatched mugs hanging from hooks, a chalkboard wall covered in Indy's drawings, a half-finished cup of chamomile tea sitting on the counter like she'd walked away from it mid-thought and never came back. The afternoon light was cutting through the window above the sink, and everything smelled like cinnamon and something warm, something that felt dangerously close to home. And Indy, 4 years old, barefoot, wearing a dinosaur shirt 2 sizes too big, she just stopped in the middle of the floor, looked up at me with those impossibly steady eyes, and asked me the question I was not ready for. "Are you going to leave us like the others did?" I want you to understand, this was not a dramatic moment in the way movies make dramatic moments look. There was no music. Nobody gasped. Indy wasn't even crying. She was just standing there, completely calm, completely serious, holding a crayon in one hand like she'd simply paused a drawing to come ask me something important. The way kids do when they don't yet know that some questions are supposed to be kept quiet. And I, a grown man who had navigated some genuinely difficult situations in his life, I had absolutely nothing. I looked at her. I looked over at the doorway, where Alora was standing with her arms crossed, leaning against the frame. She wasn't rushing to rescue me. She wasn't going to fill the silence. She was watching me the way you watch someone when you've already been disappointed enough times that you've stopped assuming the best, and you're just waiting to see what actually happens. The tension in that kitchen was the kind you feel in your chest before you feel it anywhere else. And I thought, standing there, completely exposed under the gaze of a 4-year-old, and the woman I was falling for in ways I hadn't fully admitted to myself yet, I thought, how did I get here? Because 6 months earlier, I was not a man standing in anyone's kitchen. I was not someone's potential. I was not a person Indy would have ever met. 6 months earlier, I was a man who had convinced himself that keeping distance was the same thing as being smart. That not needing people was the same thing as being strong. That a life lived cleanly, without too much attachment, without too much risk, was a life worth living. And then Alora Monroe walked into my world, and she brought that little girl with her, and every single thing I thought I knew about myself started asking harder questions. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because before I can tell you who Alora is, and before I can tell you what Indy's question meant, I need to take you back to where this actually started. Not the pretty version. Not the version where I seem like I had any idea what I was doing. The real version, the one that began not with a grand gesture or a planned moment, but with a collision. With a situation I walked into thinking I was there to help someone else, and ended up being the one completely undone. This is the story of how I met a woman I had no business falling for, in circumstances that made falling for her the most complicated thing I could have possibly done. It's a story about walls, the ones we build, the ones we inherit from the people who were supposed to protect us, and the ones we don't even realize are there until someone small enough to slip past them just walks right through. Welcome back to the Empire, and if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now, because this story is not going in the direction you think it is. Every time I tried to predict where it was going, I was wrong. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. I want to know who's in this community with me. We're building something here, and it starts with you showing up. Now, let's go back to where this all began. Let me take you back 6 months before that kitchen. 6 months before Indy's question stopped me cold. It was a Saturday morning in September, and I had driven 40 minutes out of the city for reasons I was still lying to myself about. I told myself it was business, a property consultation in the area, a meeting that could have waited, a detour that made no practical sense. But the truth was quieter and more inconvenient than that. The truth was, I had heard through someone who knew someone that Alora Monroe had moved to Cliffside, and some part of me, The part I'd spent 4 years trying to reason out of existence. Needed to see that for myself. The farmer's market was exactly the kind of place Elora would love. That much hadn't changed. Open air, local vendors, the smell of fresh bread mixing with late summer flowers, people moving slowly because they actually had time to move slowly. I spotted her from across the market, and for a moment I just stood there, completely still, while the world moved around me. She was wearing a white linen shirt and dark jeans, her hair pulled back loosely the way she used to wear it on Sunday mornings. She was talking to a vendor, laughing at something he said, and she looked like someone who had rebuilt her life so completely that she hadn't left any space for what we used to be. And then I saw Indy, a little girl, her little girl, crouched down between two wooden crates of strawberries, completely absorbed in the task of picking out the ones she liked best. She'd hold one up, inspect it with the kind of serious focus that only small children and scientists apply to things, then either place it carefully into the basket or put it back with equal deliberateness. She was wearing a yellow cardigan and muddy sneakers, and she was the most earnest thing I had ever seen. I walked over before I had a plan. That's the honest version. Elora. She turned, and the laugh she'd been wearing for the vendor disappeared. Not in a dramatic way. Elora had never been dramatic. It just cleared from her face, the way weather changes. What replaced it was something more careful, more measured. The expression of someone who has learned, at significant personal cost, not to react too quickly. Calloway. She said my name the way you say the name of something that surprised you. Not warmly, not coldly, just with a kind of neutrality that somehow hurt more than either. I didn't know you were in Cliffside, I said, which was a lie so thin she could probably see through it from where she was standing. She looked at me for a moment. Then she looked back at Indy, who had still not noticed me, and she called out, "Baby, stay where I can see you, okay?" "Okay, Mama," Indy said, without looking up from her strawberries. Elora turned back to me, and she crossed her arms. Not aggressively. It wasn't a challenge. It was more like she was holding herself together. Like she'd learned that particular posture the way soldiers learn to stand at ease. It looked relaxed, but it was anything but. "What are you doing here, Calloway?" "I was in the area. I have a consultation nearby." She nodded, slowly. The kind of nod that means, I hear you, and I don't believe you at the same time. "How are you?" I tried. Fine. Clean. Final. No invitation for more. I looked at Indy, still crouched between the strawberry crates. "She's beautiful, Elora." Something moved across her face. Pride, maybe, or protectiveness, or both. "She is," she said. And then, nothing else. I was losing ground. Quickly. I could feel it. That familiar sensation of standing in front of Elora Monroe and realizing that all the things I was good at, negotiation, strategy, knowing exactly what to say to get the outcome I needed, none of it worked with her. It never had. She had always been able to see past the version of me I presented to the world, straight to the actual person underneath, and that person had never been as impressive as the packaging suggested. "I've thought about calling," I said, "but you didn't." She wasn't accusing me. That was the worst part. She was just stating a fact, the way you'd state that it rained last Thursday. "No," I admitted. "I didn't." Another nod. She reached out and adjusted a small item on the vendor's table beside her. Some automatic gesture. Something to do with her hands. "Is there something you need, Calloway? Because I have a full morning, and Indy's waiting for her strawberries." And that's when I said it. The thing I hadn't planned to say. The thing that came out before I could route it through whatever filter I usually used. "I just needed to see you." Elora went very still. Not the way people go still when they're surprised. The way they go still when they've heard something they already knew was true, and were hoping wouldn't be said out loud. She looked at me for a long moment, and then she said, quietly enough that Indy wouldn't hear, "Do you know what today is?" I didn't. It's the first Saturday in 4 years that Indy hasn't woken up asking where her daddy was. She paused. Not you specifically. Her father. The one she's never actually met. She stopped asking this morning. Just stopped. She climbed into my bed, asked me if we could get strawberries. And that was it. Another pause. I cried in the bathroom for 10 minutes because I didn't know if I was relieved or devastated for her. I didn't have anything to say to that. There was nothing to say. You chose your empire over us, Calloway. Her voice didn't shake. That was the thing about Elora. She'd done enough of her falling apart in private that by the time she said hard things out loud, they came out steady. You had a choice. Every single time, every late night, every canceled dinner, every morning I reached for you, and you were already at your desk, you made a choice. And it was never us. I know, I said. And I did. That was the unbearable part. I couldn't even defend myself, because she wasn't wrong. Mama! Indy's voice rose from between the crates. I found the best ones. Come look. Elora's expression shifted immediately, the way parents can shift like that, moving from one emotional frequency to another in an instant because they have to. She looked over at Indy, and she softened. Then she looked back at me, and the softness didn't entirely disappear, but it became something else, something more complicated. I have to go, she said. Can the first. I have to go, Calloway. I stood there and watched her walk back to Indy, watched her crouch down next to her daughter, look at the strawberries Indy was holding up with both hands, and smile, genuinely, completely, in a way she hadn't once smiled in my direction. And I thought about what it meant that she could do that. Move from a conversation that would have flattened most people and fold herself, without hesitation, entirely into her daughter's world. Because that was love, wasn't it? Not the complicated kind. Not the kind I'd been so busy performing for 4 years that I'd forgotten to actually practice it. But the simple, daily, showing up kind. The kind Elora had always been capable of. The kind I had told myself I was providing, even as I was absent in every way that mattered. She chose her empire over us. I turned those words over the entire walk back to my car. Because the thing about an accusation you can't deny is that it doesn't go away once the conversation ends. It follows you. It sits in the passenger seat on the drive home. It waits for you in the quiet parts of your day when there's nothing loud enough to drown it out. I had built something extraordinary by most measures. A company that employed hundreds of people. A reputation that preceded me into every room I entered. A life that looked, from the outside, like success in its most complete form. And I had done it at the direct expense of the only thing that, sitting here now, I would trade all of it to have back. Have you ever run into someone from your past and realized, truly realized, not just suspected that you never actually moved on? Leave it in the comments, because I want to hear from you. Because Calloway is standing in a parking lot right now, understanding something 4 years too late. He had never stopped loving Elora Monroe. Not for a single day. And he had spent every one of those days pretending otherwise. That lie was about to cost him far more than he was ready to pay. The drive back to the city took 40 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the dashboard the entire way. The way you watch something when your mind is too loud to settle on anything else, and the numbers at least give you something neutral to focus on. The highway opened up past the cliffside exit, and the further I drove from the farmer's market, from Indy's muddy sneakers, and Elora's crossed arms, and the accusation I couldn't dispute, the more the city began to reassemble itself on the horizon, glass towers, steel frameworks, the skyline I had helped shape in ways most people in those towers would never know. I used to feel something when I drove back into it. Ownership, purpose, the specific satisfaction of a man returning to a place he had built. That afternoon, pulling into the underground garage of the Hale Tower, my building, named with the kind of quiet arrogance I'd told myself was confidence, I felt nothing but the particular emptiness that follows a conversation you can't take back. The elevator opened directly into the penthouse. That had been a deliberate design choice, when I bought the floor. No hallway, no neighbors, no in-between space. You stepped out of the elevator, and you were immediately in the middle of something enormous. 40-foot ceilings, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor. Furniture selected by a designer whose name I'd forgotten within a week of signing the invoice because it hadn't mattered to me then and didn't matter to me now. The penthouse was cold. Not in temperature, the system was precise, calibrated to exactly the right degree. Cold in the way that spaces without people in them eventually become cold. It had been a long time since there had been consistent, regular people in this space. A long time since there had been laughter that didn't belong to a catered event. A long time since anyone had left something of themselves behind. A book face down on the coffee table, a half-filled glass, shoes by the door. I set my keys on the kitchen counter and stood there for a moment in the silence. Elora would have hated this apartment. I knew that with complete certainty. She had always believed that spaces should feel like someone actually lived in them. She used to rearrange things in our old house on Sunday afternoons, not because anything was wrong with where it was, but because she said rooms needed to breathe, needed to be moved through, and changed and lived in. She'd have taken one look at this penthouse and said it felt like a very expensive hotel that no one had checked into. She wouldn't have been wrong. I poured a glass of water I didn't drink and sat down at the kitchen island. And the memories came the way they always came when I stopped moving long enough to let them. Without invitation, without order, without mercy. The night I met Elora Monroe. It was a charity gala. One of those events I attended more out of obligation than interest. A necessary appearance. A handshake circuit. The kind of evening where the conversations were polished and shallow and everyone was performing a version of themselves optimized for the room. I had been doing 3 of these a month for years. I was good at them the way you get good at anything you do without caring about it. Mechanically, efficiently, completely on autopilot. And then I heard her. I didn't see her first. I heard her. She was somewhere to my left, engaged in what I can only describe as a dismantling. She was taking apart an argument someone had made about urban development with the kind of precise, unapologetic intelligence that most people in those rooms kept carefully hidden because it made the wrong kind of impression. She wasn't shouting. She wasn't performing. She was just right. Completely and calmly right. In a way that made the other person's position sound increasingly fragile with every word she added. I turned around. She was wearing a black dress that she had clearly chosen because she liked it, not because someone had told her it was appropriate. Her hair was down. She had a glass of sparkling water in one hand, and she was using the other to make a point. And when the person she was speaking to finally conceded something she'd been arguing, she didn't gloat. She just nodded, like she'd expected it to land eventually, and took a sip of her water. I spent 45 minutes finding a reason to be introduced to her. When I finally was, she shook my hand and said, "Calloway Hale, I know who you are." "I hope that's not a bad thing," I said. She considered it, genuinely considered it, which nobody did. "The jury's still out," she said. And then she smiled, not the polished, practiced smile of someone working a room, but a real one, quick and slightly crooked, like it surprised even her. I was completely undone within the first 4 minutes. That was the beginning. And I want you to understand what kind of beginning it was, because it was not gentle or gradual. It was immediate. We fell into each other the way people do when they recognize something in someone else that they hadn't known they were looking for. Suddenly, and with a force that doesn't leave room for second guessing. We had 2 years together before everything began to fracture. And the fracture didn't announce itself the way I always imagined a fracture would. It didn't arrive as a fight or a revelation. It arrived as a phone call on a Wednesday night in October. My father had collapsed at the office. By the time I got to the hospital, the word stroke had already been used by 3 different people, and my mother was sitting in a corridor chair with her hands folded in her lap and her face completely white. She didn't cry when I sat down next to her. My mother has never been a woman who cries where other people can see her. She just looked at me and said, "He was asking for you." My father was the company. Not in the way people say that about founders. He actually was the company. Every decision, every relationship, every deal that kept the whole structure standing was either made by him or depended on him. And lying in a hospital bed at 63, with the left side of his face temporarily uncooperative and a medical team using words like recovery timeline and significant adjustments, he looked at me from that bed and said 3 words: "Don't let it fall." I should have asked him which thing he meant, the company or our family. In my defense, and I offer this not as an excuse but as context, I was 29 years old, terrified, and I did not yet know that those were 2 separate things that required 2 separate answers. I chose the company. I told myself I was choosing both. Alora tried to reach me. I want to be clear about that, because it matters. She did not disappear quietly or give up without effort. She tried every way she knew how. There was a night, I think it was our 3rd wedding anniversary, though I've spent enough time trying not to remember it that I can't be entirely certain, when I came home at 2 in the morning to find her sitting at the kitchen table. Not waiting up for me. She'd stopped doing that months earlier. She was just sitting there, in the way that people sit when they've run out of things to do and don't want to go to sleep, because sleep feels like giving up on something. She didn't yell at me when I walked in. She just looked at me and said, "Do you still love me?" And the devastating thing, the thing that has followed me every day since, is that I said yes without hesitation, because it was true. I did love her. I just didn't know how to make that love take up enough space to matter to her, not while everything else was taking up all the available room. She nodded. Then she said, "I believe you, but I don't think that's enough anymore." 6 months later, the divorce papers were on my desk. I didn't fight them. I sat with them for 9 days, during which I picked up my phone and put it down again more times than I can count, and then I signed them, because I told myself that fighting for her when I couldn't change what I was doing felt dishonest, that if I couldn't give her the version of me she deserved, the least I could do was let her go cleanly. It was the most elegantly rationalized cowardice of my entire life. What I didn't account for, what the 30-year-old version of me, so certain that sacrifice was the same thing as strength, completely failed to calculate, was the compound cost of all those choices made in isolation. My sister Bellamy had needed me the same year I lost Alora. Not dramatically. Not in the way crises announce themselves in the movies. She'd needed me the way people who are very good at appearing fine need you. Quietly, in the background, in ways that are easy to miss if you're not paying close enough attention. And I wasn't. I was in boardrooms and on international calls and managing a board of directors who had spent the better part of 18 months circling the company like they were waiting for someone to blink. By the time I understood what Bellamy was going through, she was already deep inside something that would take her years to come back from. I couldn't save her either. My mother carried that grief the way she carries everything, without showing it to anyone, which somehow made it heavier for everyone around her. I told myself, through all of it, that the sacrifice was purposeful, that I was building something worth building, that the people I loved would eventually be able to point to what I'd created and understand why it had cost what it cost. But sitting in this penthouse tonight, in the silence of a space that had never quite become a home, I couldn't actually picture anyone saying that. I couldn't picture Alora looking at the Hale Tower and thinking it was worth what she'd lost. I couldn't picture Bellamy measuring her hardest years against the square footage of my success and finding the numbers balanced. I'd built an empire on a promise I made to a man in a hospital bed. And in keeping that promise, I had broken every other one. I found her number on a crumpled receipt at the bottom of my jacket pocket 3 days after seeing her at the farmer's market. I don't remember writing it down. I must have gotten it from somewhere, an old contact, a mutual connection, because I hadn't had the courage to ask her directly. I stared at it for 3 days, not because I didn't want to call, But because I knew that if I opened that door again, I'd have to face the truth. I was never strong enough to choose her when it mattered. And I still didn't know if I was. Wednesday arrived the way Wednesdays do, when you're dreading and anticipating something simultaneously. Too fast, and somehow also endlessly slow. I had not slept well since Saturday. That particular combination of Alora's steady gaze and Indy's careful strawberry inspection had taken up residence somewhere in my chest, and refused to vacate. I'd gone through the week on the surface of things, meetings attended, decisions made, contracts reviewed, while underneath, something kept pulling my attention back to that crumpled receipt sitting on the corner of my desk. I'd moved it twice. Once to a drawer, which felt too final. Once back out, which felt too deliberate. By Wednesday, it had found a middle ground at the edge of my desk, within eye line but not directly in front of me, like I was trying to pretend it was just there by accident. My office was on the 42nd floor of Hale Tower. The harbor view from that height does something to your perception of the city. Makes everything look simultaneously enormous and manageable, like you're far enough away that the details blur, and only the shape of things remains. I had made some of the most significant decisions of my professional life standing at that window. Acquisitions, restructurings, the kind of choices that get written about in financial publications and discussed in business school case studies. None of them had required this much nerve. I sat at my desk at 6:15, when the office had emptied, and the floor was quiet, and I picked up the receipt. Looked at her number, which I had memorized 2 days ago without meaning to, because that's what happens when you spend enough time staring at something. And I thought about all the reasons not to call. She'd made herself clear. She'd moved on. She had Indy to protect. I had no right to walk back in and ask for space in a life I had voluntarily left. And then I thought about Indy crouching between those strawberry crates, holding one up to the light. I called. It rang 4 times. Long enough that I had already begun composing the voicemail in my head. Something measured. Something that didn't tip too far into territory she'd made clear she wasn't ready for. She picked up. Callaway. Same as at the market. Neutral. Careful. Waiting to understand what she was dealing with before she committed to a response. I know I'm probably the last person you expected to hear from tonight. You're not, she said. I've been waiting to see if you'd call. I just didn't know if I wanted you to. That kind of honesty, that was always Elora. Not brutal, not performed, just completely direct, because she'd decided a long time ago that the alternative wasn't worth the energy. Can I say something? I asked. A pause. Short, but present. Go ahead. Letting you go was the biggest mistake of my life. I said it the way I'd said everything to her, without the careful framing I used in boardrooms, because she always saw through that anyway. I knew it when I signed those papers. I've known it every day since. I just didn't know what to do with that knowledge. The silence on her end was different this time. Not the controlled silence of someone waiting. Something more tentative. More human. Callaway. I'm not asking you to forgive me tonight, I said. I'm not asking for anything that big. I needed to say that. I've been carrying it for 4 years, and it needs to go somewhere that isn't just the inside of my own head. Another pause. Longer. That's a very clean way of putting it, she said finally, and I couldn't tell if she meant it as a compliment or a critique. Probably both. I know. I let that sit. Then, how is Indy? Something shifted in her voice, slight, but I could hear it. The automatic softening that happened whenever her daughter entered the conversation. She's good. She's asleep. She spent the last hour telling me a very detailed story about a caterpillar named Gerald who wanted to be an astronaut. Did Gerald make it? Gerald's still in development, she said. And there, underneath all the careful distance, was the smallest trace of a smile in her voice. Barely there. But I knew her well enough to recognize it. Then she said, if you're calling because you want to see where this goes, and her voice had shifted again, back to something more deliberate, more measured, then you need to understand something first. Okay. Indy isn't a side effect of my life, Callaway. She's not background. She's not something I manage around the things I want. She is the thing. A beat. And if you come back into my world and you hurt her, not even intentionally, just by being the person you've historically been when things get complicated, I will never forgive you. I want you to understand that completely before you say another word. The weight of that settled over the conversation like weather. I understand, I said. Do you? Not aggressive, genuinely asking. I'm starting to, I said, which is honest. More honest than telling you I have it all figured out. Another long pause, the kind where you can feel the other person thinking on the other side of it. She liked you, Elora said finally, quietly, at the market. She kept asking me afterward who the man with the nice shoes was. Something happened in my chest when she said that. Something warm and terrifying and completely unexpected. Nice shoes? She notices things. She always has. A pause. She's perceptive in ways that make being her mother both remarkable and occasionally exhausting. I laughed. Quietly. And then she laughed. Also quietly. Also carefully. Like she was surprised to be doing it. Waterfront Park, she said. Saturday, 2 o'clock. I'm not promising anything beyond that, but a breath. Come. I held the phone after she hung up, and I sat very still, looking at the harbor from 42 floors up. The harbor was doing what it always does at that hour, moving, slowly and endlessly, reflecting the city lights in long broken lines across the water. I had looked at that view hundreds of times, and felt something that I'd always called peace, but now understood was probably closer to numbness. The quiet of a man who had made himself too busy to notice what was missing. Tonight, it felt different. Tonight, the water looked like possibility, which was not a word I would have used to describe any harbor view 12 months ago. But the thing that was sitting with me, the thing I couldn't quite place at first, was the realization that had moved very quietly from the edge of my consciousness to the center of it during that phone call. It wasn't about me and Elora. Not entirely. Not anymore. It was about Indy, a 4-year-old who had asked who the man with the nice shoes was, who spent her evenings narrating astronaut caterpillar sagas to her mother, who crouched between strawberry crates with the focused seriousness of someone who understood that the best ones required real attention to find. Elora had said it clearly. If you hurt Indy, I'll never forgive you. And I had heard it and agreed to it, without fully understanding until right now what it would actually mean to honor that. Because it wasn't a threat, it was a standard. And the standard wasn't about grand gestures or being impressive or any of the things I was genuinely good at. It was about consistency, reliability, the daily unglamorous practice of being someone a child could count on. That terrified me more than any boardroom, any acquisition, any negotiation I had ever walked into, because I could learn a lot of things. I had built a career on learning things quickly and executing them well. But being the kind of person a child trusts, you can't learn that in a meeting. You can't prepare a strategy for it. You either show up and mean it, or you don't. And sitting there at 6:40 on a Wednesday evening, I genuinely did not know which one I was capable of. What would you do if you got a second chance with someone you thought you'd lost forever? Would you take the risk or play it safe? Tell me in the comments, because Calloway is about to walk into that park on Saturday and bet everything on something he can't guarantee, that a little girl who has already learned not to trust too easily might, if he shows up the right way, decide to trust him anyway. Saturday arrived with the particular brightness of a morning that doesn't know what's at stake. I got to Waterfront Park 12 minutes early, which tells you everything about where my head was. I am not a person who arrives 12 minutes early to anything. I am precise. I arrive when I mean to arrive, not before, because early implies eagerness, and I had spent 20 years cultivating the impression of a man who is always exactly where he intends to be. But there I was at 1:48 in the afternoon, sitting on a bench near the park's south entrance, watching families move through the afternoon sun and trying to look like I wasn't watching the gate. The park was alive in a way my world rarely was. Children running ahead of parents. A couple sharing a bag of popcorn on the grass. Somewhere nearby, a food vendor was doing significant business in lemonade. The air smelled like CT grass and something floral, jasmine, I thought, from the beds that ran along the east path. And the whole atmosphere had the quality of a place that knew it was supposed to be enjoyed and had committed fully to that purpose. I saw Alora and Indy before they saw me. They were coming up the main path, and Indy was not walking. She was moving in that specific way small children move when they are very excited about where they're going, and their legs are doing their best to express that. Half skipping, half walking, one hand holding Alora's, the other swinging freely. She was wearing yellow, a yellow dress with white sneakers that were already not entirely white, and she was talking animatedly, presumably continuing whatever story about Gerald, the astronaut caterpillar she had been developing all week. Alora was listening, actually listening, not the polite listening of someone waiting for their turn to speak, but the real kind, where your whole face is involved. She nodded at something Indy said, and Indy looked up at her, satisfied, and then looked forward and saw me. She stopped walking. Alora felt the stop and looked down at her. Then, up at me. I raised a hand in a wave that I immediately felt was the least sophisticated gesture I had produced in years. Alora's expression was careful, not cold, but held. Indy, on the other hand, studied me for approximately 3 seconds with the intense evaluative focus I was beginning to understand was simply how she looked at everything. And then she turned to her mother and said something I couldn't hear from this distance. Alora nodded, and Indy, this 4-year-old in yellow who had no idea what she was doing to me, walked directly over, stopped in front of my bench, and said, "You have nice shoes again." "Thank you," I said. "I like your dress." She looked down at it, apparently confirming she agreed with my assessment. "It's my yellow one," she said, as though this explained everything. Then she looked back up at me. "Do you know about the fountain?" "I don't think I do." Alora had reached us now. She stood a half step back, in that position I was starting to recognize as her default, close enough to be present, far enough to be watching. She had a small canvas bag over one shoulder and sunglasses pushed back on her head, and she looked, very simply, like herself, like the version of herself that existed outside of armor. "The fountain is magic," Indy informed me, with the confidence of someone sharing a well-established fact. "But you have to wish for the right thing." "What's the right thing?" I asked. She considered this seriously. "Something happy," she said. "If you wish for something happy, it works better." She looked at her mother. Alora gave her a small nod, permission, or confirmation, or both. And then Indy looked at me, reached up, and took my hand. It was such a small thing. Her hand in mine, tiny, warm, completely unceremonious. She just took it, the way children take things they've decided belong to them, and started walking toward the fountain without any indication that she'd done anything remarkable. I looked at Alora over Indy's head. Alora was watching me the way she'd been watching me at the farmer's market, testing, measuring, waiting. But there was something else underneath it now. Something she was working to keep from showing. I held Indy's hand and walked toward the fountain. The fountain was in the center of the park, a wide circular basin with a simple stone column at the center, the kind of fountain that had probably been there for decades and would be there for decades more. Coins glinted from the bottom in the afternoon light. Indy approached it with the reverence of someone arriving at a place that genuinely mattered. She reached into the pocket of her yellow dress and produced 3 pennies with the careful preparation of someone who had planned this. She handed one to Alora, one to me, and kept one for herself. "You have to close your eyes," she said. "And it has to be real. The fountain knows if you're pretending." I looked at the penny in my palm. Then I closed my eyes. I didn't think about the company. I didn't think about the board, or the contracts, or the 42 floors of glass and steel that I had built my identity inside of. I stood there at a park fountain on a Saturday afternoon with a coin in my hand, and I wished, as simply and directly as I was capable of, for a second chance. Not for the company to survive, not for some external measure of success. For this. For Elora looking at me without armor. For Indy's hand in mine. For the chance to be someone different than the person I'd been. Not dramatically different, not unrecognizable, but different in the ways that mattered. I dropped the coin. When I opened my eyes, Indy was watching me. "What did you wish for?" she asked. "Something happy," I said. She nodded, satisfied. "Good," she said. "Those are the ones that work." From the fountain we wandered because Indy's approach to any outing was fundamentally a wander, with occasional decisive turns toward things that caught her interest. She stopped at a man playing guitar near the East Path and listened with complete attention for a full 2 minutes before deciding she'd heard enough and moving on. She crouched to examine a beetle on the sidewalk with the same focused seriousness she'd given the strawberries. She asked me at one point whether I thought beetles preferred morning or afternoon, and when I said I honestly didn't know, she said, "Me neither. I've been thinking about it." Near the park's weekend farmers market, smaller than the cliffside one, but lively, she spotted a flower vendor and made her way there with purpose. I followed. Elora followed. And somewhere in the middle of watching Indy deliberate between a yellow sunflower and an orange one with the seriousness of someone making an important architectural decision, I became aware that Elora was watching me. Not watching Indy, watching me. I glanced over. She didn't look away. "She's something," I said quietly. "She is," Elora said. Same words as at the market, but differently. Indy settled on the orange flower. "Because orange is brave," she explained, and then turned around and walked straight into me, apparently having decided a hug was appropriate for this moment. She wrapped both arms around my knees, which was as high as she could comfortably reach, pressed her face against my leg, and said, into the fabric of my trousers, "Hugs help." I looked down at her. I looked at Elora. Elora's expression was doing something complex, something she hadn't entirely planned for, something she was navigating in real time. There was the guardedness, yes, still present, doing its careful work. But there was also something that looked, just barely, like the beginning of a possibility she hadn't allowed herself to name. I put my hand on Indy's back, gently, the way you do when something matters too much to rush. We found a patch of grass near the water as the afternoon began its slow turn toward evening, and Elora spread out the light blanket she'd packed in her canvas bag, and Indy ate exactly half a muffin from the farmer's market before deciding she was finished and repositioning herself to use Elora's lap as a pillow. Within minutes her eyes were closing, the orange flower still held loosely in one hand. Elora stroked her hair automatically, the way parents do when it's been practiced into reflex. I sat nearby, a safe distance, watching the water. At some point, before she fell fully asleep, Indy opened her eyes and looked at me. Just looked, for a moment, with that particular stillness she had. Then she said, "Are you sad?" I opened my mouth to say no. The automatic answer. The managed answer. "Sometimes," I said instead. Indy considered this. "Me too," she said. "Sometimes I'm sad, and I don't know why." She looked at the ceiling of sky above her. "Mama says that's okay." "Mama's right," I said. Indy closed her eyes. Within 2 minutes, she was fully asleep. I looked at Elora. Elora looked at me. Neither of us said anything for a long time, because there are moments where the thing happening between people is bigger than language, and the kindest thing you can do is not reach for words you don't have yet. The sun was moving down toward the water, and the light it left behind was the soft, forgiving kind that makes everything look slightly more beautiful than it is. Indy's breathing was steady, and even on her mother's lap. The orange flower had fallen from her hand onto the blanket, and I realized, sitting there in the quiet of that Saturday afternoon, that something had shifted in me in a way I couldn't catalog or manage or turn into a strategy. I didn't just want Elora back. I wanted this. This exact configuration of things, the light, the grass, this child sleeping with complete trust between us, this woman who was watching me with eyes that held 4 years of hurt and something newer underneath it that hadn't been named yet. I wanted the ordinary, accumulating daily weight of a life lived with these two people in it. And I had absolutely no idea if I deserved it. That first Saturday at Waterfront Park did not fix anything. I want to be honest about that, because the easier version of this story would have that afternoon serve as a turning point, the moment everything softened and the path forward opened up cleanly. But that's not what happened. What happened was smaller and more complicated than that. What happened was a second Saturday, and then a third, and then we stopped counting. The aquarium was Indy's idea. She had been lobbying for it, apparently, for several weeks on the grounds that she needed to see sharks in real life, not just in books, and that this was an urgent and legitimate need. Elora told me this in the car on the way there, and I watched Indy in the back seat nodding with great seriousness and confirmation, because she felt the point had been well made and required her endorsement. Inside, she moved through the aquarium the way she moved through everything, with a specific combination of determination and wonder that made you want to follow her just to see what she'd find worth stopping for. She stopped at the jellyfish. She stopped at the seahorses, which she told us were her second favorites. She stopped at every information panel and listened while Elora read them to her, filing the facts away with focused attention. And then we reached the shark tank. It was enormous, a floor-to-ceiling curved window, the water behind it dark and full of movement. A school of smaller fish parting and regrouping around the slow, unhurried movement of a large nurse shark making a circuit of the tank. Indy pressed forward through the small crowd of visitors until she was directly at the glass, her nose nearly touching it, her hands flat against the surface. She was too short to see the upper half of the tank. She looked at me. Not at Elora. At me. With complete simplicity. Like the solution was obvious. "I can't see the top part," she said. I bent down and picked her up. It was an instinctive movement, not overthought, not performed. She settled against my arm with the easy confidence of a child who has decided you're capable of holding her, and I lifted her so she could see the full height of the full tank. And she pressed her hands flat against the glass again from up there, and she went very quiet in the specific way she went quiet when something had her full attention. "There's 2 of them," she said softly, as though she didn't want to disturb anything. "There are," I said. She turned to look at Elora, still on the ground below us. "Mama, there's 2. Elora looked up at us, at Indy's face against the glass, and my arm around her. And I saw her reach into her bag for her phone. She held it up. The camera clicked. Then I watched something cross her face. Something private. She looked at the photo, and something moved behind her eyes, and she lowered the phone and put it back in her bag without showing me what she'd taken. I didn't ask, but I noticed. The museum came 2 weeks later. It was a natural history museum with an exhibition on ocean ecosystems that Indy had connected to the aquarium trip in her own internal logic, and she moved through it with the systematic attention of a small researcher. She had questions for each display. Good questions. The kind that made the information panels feel incomplete. We were somewhere in the middle of the 3rd gallery, in front of a display about deep-sea ecosystems, when Indy looked up at me and asked, with complete casualness, "Do you have a family?" The question landed cleanly and without warning, the way her questions always did. I felt Elora's awareness shift. I didn't need to look at her to know she'd tensed. Slightly, waiting. "I have a mom," I said carefully. "And a sister." Indy processed this. "What's your sister's name?" "Bellamy." "That's pretty," she said, with the decisive confidence of someone who had opinions about names. "Do you see her a lot?" There it was. The question underneath the question. Not malicious. Indy didn't have malice in her yet. just genuinely curious. Do you show up for the people in your life? Do you stay? Not as much as I should, I said. Indy looked at me for a moment. Then she nodded, as though she'd filed that away somewhere useful, and turned back to the display. Alora stepped forward smoothly and pointed to a photograph on the panel. Indy, look at this one. It says these fish can make their own light. Did you know that? Indy's attention redirected immediately. How? Let's read and find out. She moved them both away from the question. I stood there for a moment, grateful in a way I hadn't expected, and followed. The ice cream shop arrived in the 4th week, on a Saturday that had started overcast and cleared into something warm and generous by early afternoon. Indy approached the ice cream selection with the gravity of a decision that mattered, and after a consultation process that involved studying every option. Twice, she selected Birthday Cake Explosion, without hesitation, and with the satisfaction of someone who had always known that was going to be the answer. Alora ordered something simple. I ordered something simple. We sat at a small table outside while Indy applied herself to her ice cream with focused dedication. At one point, Indy dropped a piece of cone. She looked at it on the ground. She looked at us. That one's for the birds, she said philosophically, and continued eating. Alora laughed, a real laugh, unguarded, the kind I hadn't heard in 4 years. And I looked at her, and she looked at me, and for a moment there was something between us that didn't have the weight of history in it. Something lighter. Something that felt briefly and carefully like the beginning of a conversation we hadn't been ready to have before. Then she looked down at her ice cream. She didn't pull away dramatically, or excuse herself, or make something of the moment. She just quietly withdrew back behind the careful distance she'd been keeping, the way you return to a safe position after testing ground you're not sure will hold. It was so subtle that Indy didn't notice it. But I did. I didn't push. I ate my ice cream. Indy told us 3 separate facts about birthday cake that she had invented herself. And the afternoon moved forward in the uncomplicated way that afternoons do when a child is there to ensure no silence lasts too long. The picnic was Indy's idea, too. She had decided, apparently with complete conviction, that eating outside on a blanket was objectively better than eating inside at a table, and she was not wrong. Alora had packed things carefully, the kind of careful that tells you it was thought about. Sandwiches, fruit, crackers, a thermos of something warm. Indy set up the blanket with the authority of someone who took her hosting responsibilities seriously, designating specific corners for specific people. We ate. Indy finished first and spent 20 minutes in the nearby grass pursuing a personal project that she did not fully explain, but that involved collecting things and arranging them in a pattern only she understood. Alora watched her with the quiet, complete attention of someone who has learned to read a child's moods in movement. And then Indy lay down in the grass and fell asleep, the way small children do in the middle of doing something. Suddenly, completely, without announcement. Alora and I sat in silence. Not the charged silence of people who have run out of things to say. The different kind. The kind that exists between people who have too much to say and are both waiting for the right moment to say it. The sun was warm. The grass was still. Somewhere nearby a bird was making a sound it clearly considered important. She trusts you, Alora said eventually, quietly, not looking at me. She trusts everyone, I said. No, Alora said. She doesn't. She's cautious with people. She always has been. A pause. She trusts you. I didn't say anything, because there was nothing to say to that which wouldn't feel like I was trying to make it about me, when it was about Indy. Alora looked at her daughter, sleeping in the grass. I'm still angry at you, she said, simply, without drama. I know, I said. I want you to know that this, she gestured, broadly, at the blanket and the Saturday. And here you, whatever we were building across these weeks, doesn't mean I've stopped being angry. It just means I'm trying to do the right thing for her. I understand, I said. And I meant it. Not as a consolation, or a temporary position, but as a real thing. She wasn't offering me what I wanted. She was offering Indy what Indy needed. Those were two different things, and the least I could do was understand which one this was. It was the 5th Saturday, or maybe the 6th. I genuinely stopped tracking when it happened. We were saying goodbye in the parking lot at the edge of the park. Elora was helping Indy into her car seat, and I was standing at a respectful distance the way I'd learned to do, present, but not crowding. Indy had her orange flower from the first Saturday, or one that looked exactly like it. She'd adopted orange flowers as a recurring requirement of our outings. She looked at me from inside the car, half buckled. "Will you come back next week?" she asked. "Yes," I said. She looked at me for a moment. Then, promise. There it was. 4 letters. The smallest possible word for the largest possible thing when it comes from a child who is asking because she has learned, through experience she is too young to have been given, that people sometimes don't. I looked at Elora. Elora was watching me from the driver's door, her hand resting on the roof of the car. Her face was doing what it always did in the moments that mattered most. Nothing. Showing me nothing that she hadn't decided to show. "Promise," I said. Indy nodded, satisfied, and allowed Elora to finish buckling her. I watched them drive away. I stood in that parking lot for a while after, in the diminishing light of a Saturday evening, holding the weight of that word. Promise. The first thing I'd sworn to anyone in a very long time that wasn't about a contract, or a deadline, or a business outcome. The first thing I'd promised that cost something real. I didn't know it then. Not fully. Not clearly. But that promise was the first brick in a bridge I didn't know how to build. And every Saturday, I laid another one, hoping the whole thing would hold. Terrified. Every time. That I wasn't the kind of person who knew how to build things that lasted. That I'd built towers and companies and empires. But bridges, the kind that connected you to people, were a different architecture entirely. One I was learning for the very first time. It was the kind of evening that feels like it was arranged deliberately. The sky doing that thing it does in late summer when the last light takes its time leaving, pulling the blue down slowly through layers of copper and amber before finally letting the dark come in. We were back at the park. Not Waterfront Park this time, a smaller one closer to Cliffside, with a flat stretch of grass that Indy had decided was the superior picnic location because, as she explained with great authority, the grass is softer here, and you can see more sky. She had been right on both counts. She had also been asleep for the last 40 minutes, exactly where she'd been sitting, when sleep caught up with her, curled on her side on the blanket, one hand tucked under her cheek, the other still loosely holding a blade of grass she'd been examining before her eyes gave out on her. Her breathing was deep and even. Her orange flower was beside her, slightly crumpled. Elora and I sat in the quiet she'd left behind. The stars had started coming through, faint at first, the way they always begin, a few at a time, like they're testing the dark before committing to it. The park was nearly empty at this hour. Somewhere in the distance, a family was packing up to leave, their voices low and unhurried. Otherwise, it was just us. Just the grass and the cooling air and the specific silence of being beside someone you have a long history with and not knowing exactly what the current chapter of that history is supposed to be called. Elora had her knees pulled up, her arms wrapped loosely around them, looking at the sky. She hadn't said anything in several minutes. Neither had I. Then she said, without looking at me, "Why now?" I knew what she meant. She wasn't asking about the park, or the picnic, or the specific Saturday that had brought us here. Why now, Calloway? Why are you really here? I had thought about this question. Not in the way you prepare a speech, more in the way you turn something over repeatedly, because you know it's coming, and you want to be sure that when it does, you tell the truth. Not the managed version. Not the version that casts me in the best possible light. The actual truth, with all the unflattering parts left in. I was terrified of failing, I said. Elora didn't respond. She was listening in that way she had, completely, without filling the space. Not failing the company exactly. Or not only that. I was terrified of failing at everything. Of being the person who couldn't hold it together. The business. My father's legacy, Bellamy, you. All of it simultaneously. And somewhere along the way I made a calculation that I've spent 4 years understanding was wrong. What calculation? She asked, still looking at the sky. That if I focused on the things I could control, the company, the board, the numbers, then at least something would survive. At least there'd be one thing I hadn't failed at. I paused. I told myself I was doing it for us, that I was building something we'd eventually get to enjoy together. But that was a story I told myself, so I didn't have to admit what I was actually doing. Which was choosing what I thought I could fix, I said. Because I couldn't control losing you. I couldn't manage that or negotiate it or turn it into a deliverable. You were the thing I was most afraid of getting wrong, and instead of staying in that fear and working through it, I retreated to the thing that felt solvable. I looked at Indy sleeping on the blanket, and I lost everything that mattered. The silence that followed was not comfortable. It was the kind of silence that has weight, the kind that you sit inside and let press on you because that's what it's supposed to do. I know that doesn't fix anything, I said. I'm not telling you because I want it to. Then why are you telling me? Because you asked me a real question, I said. And you deserve a real answer, not the one that makes me look better than I was. She was quiet for a long time after that, long enough that the stars had fully committed to the sky, long enough that the last family at the far end of the park had gone, and the space was entirely ours, long enough that I wondered if she'd decided the answer wasn't enough, that the truth, delivered honestly and too late, was still just truth delivered honestly and too late. And then she turned to look at me, and I could see, even in the low light, that her eyes were wet. But it wasn't the soft, quiet kind of crying that asks for comfort. It was something harder than that, something that had been waiting in a specific place for a long time, and had finally decided it was done waiting. Do you know what it was like? Her voice was steady, but barely. Loving you and being invisible? I didn't say anything. I was there, she said. I was right there, every single day. I cooked dinner that got cold. I stayed up waiting for you when I should have been sleeping. I made myself smaller and smaller, trying to take up less of your time, less of your space, because I could see how much pressure you were under, and I actually thought, that if I was patient enough, if I just held on long enough, you'd come back to me. She paused. And you didn't. You just kept going further in. Elora, I'm not finished. Not harsh. Just firm. I don't say that to punish you. I say it because you said you wanted the truth, and that's mine. That's what the other side of those 4 years looked like. I know, I said. No, she said quietly. You know it now. You didn't know it then. And that's the part I'm still working through. She looked back at the sky. A tear moved down her cheek, and she didn't wipe it away immediately. She let it go. The way you let something go when you've been holding it too long and your hands are finally tired. I let the silence hold for a moment. Because she needed it to. Because trying to fill it immediately would have been about my discomfort, not her truth. Then I said, I don't want to go back. She looked at me. I'm not here to ask you to pretend the last 4 years were different than they were. I'm not asking you to revise history or act like the hurt isn't real, because it is, and I know it is. I looked at her directly. I want to go forward, if you'll let me. Something moved across her face. Not agreement. Not yet. Something more like the recognition of a possibility. The cautious acknowledgement that a door, which had been closed, was now slightly open. What if it doesn't work? She said. I had expected that question. I had no clean answer to it. Then we'll know we tried, I said. And we'll figure out how to handle that. That's not enough, she said. Not with Indy in it. I know. What if you leave again? The words were quiet, but they landed heavily. I won't. You can't promise that. People say that. I know people say it, I said. And I know that word doesn't carry the same weight it used to because of people who've used it and didn't mean it. I can't hand you certainty, Alora. I don't have that to give. What I can give you is this. I am not going anywhere. Not from you. Not from her. Not again. That's what I have, and I mean it in the way I mean very few things I've ever said. She looked at me for a long time. What if Indy gets hurt? She said. And in those 4 words was everything. Every layer of what it meant to be a mother. Every protective instinct. Every experience she'd had of watching her daughter's face when something disappointed her. Indy getting hurt, I said carefully, is the thing I'm most afraid of. More than losing the company. More than anything. I paused, which means I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure I'm not the cause of it. Alora looked down at her hands. The night had settled in fully now. The stars above us were dense and bright, the kind of sky you can only get away from city light, and the air had that cool, clean quality of late evening in a park where the grass has been breathing all day. Indy shifted slightly in her sleep, a small sound escaping her, and then settled back into stillness. I reached for Alora's hand. Not suddenly, not with any drama. I moved slowly enough that she could have pulled back, could have shifted away, could have made it clear she wasn't ready. I gave her every opportunity to choose otherwise. She let me take it. Her hand in mine was familiar in a way that bypassed 4 years entirely. The specific warmth of it, the way it fit, the particular reality of being in contact with a person you never actually forgot how to hold. I felt something move through her when our hands closed together. She exhaled slowly, like she'd been holding her breath for a long time without fully realizing it. She leaned into me, slightly, carefully, the way you test ice before you trust your weight to it. But she leaned, and I stayed exactly where I was, not pushing forward, not making it into something bigger than it was, just being the thing she was leaning against, being present in the way I'd failed to be for 4 years. Not impressive, not performing, not strategizing, just there. We sat like that under the stars while Indy slept, and for the first time since I'd walked away from the best thing in my life, I felt something that I had completely forgotten the texture of. Hope. Real hope. Not the managed optimism of a man who is used to making things go his way, but the terrifying, unguaranteed, completely genuine hope of someone who isn't sure how this ends and is choosing to stay anyway. If this story is hitting you somewhere deep right now, if you're feeling something in your chest that you weren't expecting today, do me a favor, smash that like button and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Because I promise you, we are not done yet. Not even close. I thought the confession was the hardest part. The tears. The honest admission of everything I'd cost her. The promise I'd made under a sky full of stars while her daughter slept beside us. I thought that was where the real weight was. I was wrong. Because 6 weeks later, Indy asked me a question in a kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon. A question I had not prepared for, could not have prepared for, and it broke me open in a way nothing before it ever had. 6 weeks. That's how long it took for Alora to trust me enough to let me through the front door of her home. Not the park. Not a restaurant. Not neutral territory where she could manage the distance and keep the exits clearly marked. Her actual home, the place where Indy's drawings covered the walls, where mismatched mugs hung from hooks above the sink, where a chalkboard painted on the kitchen wall held a running record of Indy's artwork in colors that didn't coordinate and were perfect because of it. The place that smelled like chamomile and cinnamon and the specific warmth of a space where someone has invested genuine love into daily life. I had not taken that lightly. I understood what it meant. Alora's home was not just her space, it was Indy's world. Every inch of it had been built around a child who had already learned at 4 years old that people did not always stay. Letting me meant letting me see that world, and it meant Indy seeing me in it. It was a Tuesday afternoon in early March. I had come over under the premise of helping with a shelf that had been unstable for weeks. A practical reason, an easy one, the kind of reason that doesn't ask anything big of anyone. Alora had told me about it offhandedly on a Saturday. I'd offered. She'd accepted with a small nod that I understood to mean yes, but don't make this into something. I had fixed the shelf. It had taken 20 minutes. And now I was standing in the kitchen, washing the dust off my hands at the sink, and the afternoon light was coming through the window above it in long, warm lines, and everything smelled like cinnamon from something Alora had been baking, and from the living room I could hear Indy's voice, narrating something to herself with great energy and specific sound effects. Alora was in the doorway between the kitchen and the hall, leaning against the frame with a cup of tea, watching me with that expression I'd come to know, not closed, but held, like she was reading something in me that she was still deciding whether to trust. The chamomile tea on the counter was half finished. It had been there when I arrived. Then the narrating stopped. I heard small feet on the floor, and Indy appeared in the kitchen doorway. She had been calling me Calloway for 3 weeks. Not Mr. Hale. She'd never done that, because Indy did not do formal address for people she decided she liked. Just Calloway. With the easy, unself-conscious ownership that children apply to names once they've decided a person belongs in their vocabulary. She'd started asking Alora, on the Saturdays, whether Calloway was coming. She'd started telling him things, not just the astronaut caterpillar updates, which were ongoing and increasingly complex, but real things. The things that happened at her playgroup. The dream she'd had about the ocean. The fact that her friend Maya had said something that hurt her feelings, and she wasn't sure what to do about it. She'd started saving things for me. Small things. A particularly interesting leaf. A drawing she'd done that she wanted me to see. A fact about beetles that she'd found out and needed to report. In the language of a 4-year-old, this was intimacy. This was trust, being built slowly and carefully by a child who had learned that trust was something worth being careful with. But trust, for a child who has been left before, even in ways she was too young to fully understand, trust carries its own specific terror. Because the closer you let someone get, the more it costs if they go. She had seen adults come and go in the margins of her life. Not consistently, not dramatically, but enough. Enough that somewhere inside that small, serious, perceptive person, there was a question she'd been carrying, not quite ready to ask, building toward it the way weather builds toward something. And now she was standing in the kitchen doorway in a dinosaur shirt, 2 sizes too big, barefoot, holding a crayon she'd been using for whatever project had been underway in the living room. She looked at me standing at the sink. She looked at her mother in the hallway, and she stepped fully into the kitchen. She didn't approach gradually. She walked to the middle of the kitchen floor and stopped, the way she always stopped when she had something important to say, planting herself, making the ground beneath her feel decided. She looked up at me with those eyes, the ones that didn't perform anything. The ones that had been seeing clearly since the first moment I met her at the farmer's market, when she'd inspected strawberries with the focused seriousness of someone who understood that the best things required real attention to find. "Are you going to leave us like the others did?" The kitchen went very quiet. Not the dramatic quiet of something cinematic, just the ordinary, total quiet of a moment where something true has been said, and the air around it needs a second to adjust. I looked at her. 4 years old, barefoot, a crayon in one hand, completely still and completely serious, in the way she was when she'd decided something mattered enough to ask directly. I looked at Elora. She was still in the doorway, arms crossed, not rushing in, not translating or softening or redirecting the way she'd done at the museum when the family question landed. This time, she was letting it stand, letting me face it, because this was the test. Not the confession under the stars, not the phone call, not the 6 Saturdays, or the shelf, or the fact that I'd shown up week after week. without being asked twice. This was the test. A 4-year-old asking the one question that mattered more than all of it. And I had no strategy for it. No managed response. No version of myself that was optimized for this room. I had nothing but what was actually true. I crouched down. I got down to her level, eye to eye, the way you do when you want someone to know that what you're about to say is meant for them specifically, not for the room, not for anyone listening, just for her. Indy, I said, I can't promise you that life will always be easy. I can't promise that things won't be hard sometimes, or complicated, or that every day is going to look the way you want it to. She held her crayon and listened. She was 4 years old, and she was listening like someone twice her age, with her whole face, with the full stillness of someone who understood that what was coming mattered. But I can promise you this, I said. I'm not going anywhere. Not ever. You're stuck with me. The kitchen was very still. Indy looked at me. That specific look, the one she'd given the strawberries, the beetles, the information panels at the museum. The look that meant she was deciding something, filing something, measuring what she'd heard against what she already knew, and seeing if the numbers balanced. The silence lasted long enough that I wasn't sure what was coming. Then she said, very quietly, "Can I call you Daddy?" I had held it together through a great deal in my life. I had sat at a hospital bedside and held my composure while doctors used words like significant and long-term. I had signed divorce papers without letting myself feel what I was actually doing. I had stood in boardrooms during some of the most high-pressure moments of my professional life and kept my face exactly as I needed it to be. I did not hold it together now. Something broke loose. I don't have a cleaner way to describe it than that. It came from somewhere I hadn't known was full. Some held place inside me that had been storing 4 years of choices and costs, and the particular grief of having chosen the wrong things for reasons I'd told myself were right. It came from the specific reality of a 4-year-old in a dinosaur shirt, asking me if she could call me Daddy, with the same calm seriousness she brought to everything she decided mattered. I nodded. I couldn't speak. I tried and found that the words were not accessible in that moment, which had never happened to me in a professional context in my entire adult life, and which turned out to be completely beside the point. I nodded, and Indy crossed the remaining distance between us and wrapped both arms around my neck, and I held her, this small, warm, impossibly certain person, and I pressed my eyes shut, and I held on. From the doorway, I heard Elora. Not words. Just the specific sound of someone who has been strong for a very long time, suddenly not needing to be. I looked up and she was still in the doorway, her arms no longer crossed, one hand over her mouth, tears moving freely down her face. Not performing it, not managing it, just letting it happen, the way she'd let that tear fall under the stars, because she was done holding it back. We stayed in that kitchen for a long moment. Indy's arms around my neck. Elora in the doorway. The afternoon light coming through the window above the sink. And something that had been broken for 4 years became, in that kitchen, on a Tuesday afternoon, something that had a chance of being whole. That was the moment I stopped running. The moment I stopped trying to manage what couldn't be managed and control what never should have been about control. I had built towers and companies and an empire with my name on the side of it. And none of it had ever made me feel the way this did, crouched on a kitchen floor, holding a 4-year-old, finally understanding what it actually meant to be somewhere that mattered. It was the scariest, most beautiful thing I had ever done. 6 months later. That's where I want to take you now. Not to a single defining moment, but to a Tuesday morning in September. Ordinary in almost every way. The kind of morning that doesn't announce itself as significant while it's happening, but that you carry with you, quietly, long after it's gone. The kitchen. The same one with the mismatched mugs and the chalkboard wall and the shelf I fixed in March, which was still holding with the specific satisfaction of something repaired properly. I was making pancakes. This had become a Tuesday thing, not because anyone had officially decided it was, but because the first time I'd made them, Indy had eaten 4 of them and told me with complete sincerity that they were the best thing that had ever happened. And after a declaration like that, you don't stop making pancakes on Tuesdays. She was beside me at the counter, standing on her step stool, wearing her dinosaur shirt, a different one now, this one blue, but the same essential garment and spirit, and helping in the way that Indy helped with things, which meant she was deeply involved, completely committed, and adding an element of unpredictability to the process that kept me paying attention. She had opinions about the batter. Specifically, she believed it needed more stirring than I was giving it, and she was not shy about expressing this. "It has to be smooth," she told me, taking the spoon with both hands and beginning to stir with the focused energy of someone correcting an oversight. "You're right," I said. "I know," she said, simply, without arrogance, just the calm confidence of someone who has always known her own mind. Behind us, Elora came into the kitchen. She was in the soft light of a September morning, still in the oversized sweater she wore on mornings she didn't have to be anywhere too early, her hair loose, one hand already reaching for the coffee pot before she'd fully arrived. She poured her cup, and on the way past, she reached over and stole the first pancake off the plate, the one I'd set aside because it had come out slightly more golden than the others, and I'd known, without discussing it with anyone, that it was the best one. She ate it standing at the counter with the unashamed satisfaction of someone exercising a right she'd earned. "That was the best one," I said. "Mm-hmm," she said, into her coffee. Indy watched this exchange with great interest. Then she looked at me and said, with the gravity of a legal advisor, "You should have hidden it." "I'll know for next time," I said. Drop off was at 8:15. Indy's school was a 10-minute drive from the house, a low building surrounded by a painted fence, and a playground that she had assessed and approved on her first visit. She had a specific relationship with her classroom. She knew exactly where her hook was, exactly which table she sat at, exactly which of her classmates was most likely to have something interesting to show her on any given morning. She walked in like she owned the place, which I had come to understand was simply Indy's relationship with any space she decided she liked. On this particular Tuesday, she had her backpack on, green, with a small dinosaur pin she'd picked out herself, and she was carrying a drawing she had completed the previous evening and wanted to show her teacher immediately. She had explained the drawing to me in the car on the way over with the comprehensive detail of someone presenting a project. It was Gerald, the astronaut caterpillar, now orbiting the moon, which Indy had decided was the appropriate next development in his story. Gerald was doing well. She pushed through the gate to the playground, took 3 steps, then turned back around. "Bye, Daddy," she called with complete ease. The way you say something you've said enough times that it has settled into the natural rhythm of your life. "Bye, Mommy." Then she turned back around and walked into school. I stood at the gate. A couple of other parents were nearby, the usual Tuesday morning configuration of people in various states of coffee readiness, managing the handoff of their children to the school day. A few of them looked over, not rudely, just the ordinary noticing of people in a shared space. I didn't care. Not even slightly. Not even in the distant, managed way where you pretend not to care, but you're still aware of the audience. I simply didn't care, because Indy had called me Daddy in a school parking lot on a Tuesday morning in September, and everything else was too small to compete with that. Elora was beside me. She slipped her hand into mine. "Come on," she said. "I need more coffee before the world gets to have me." Date nights had become Fridays. Not every Friday. Life with a 4-year-old did not accommodate every Friday as a reliable plan, but most Fridays. When Elora's neighbor Donna was available and willing to be absolutely delighted by Indy for 2 hours, we had the porch to ourselves. It wasn't complicated. It didn't need to be. A bottle of something good, whatever Elora felt like cooking, or whatever I'd picked up on the way over, the porch with its 2 chairs, and the view of the backyard where Indy's fairy garden occupied one corner, a small patch of deliberate wildness that Indy maintained with the focused dedication of a groundskeeper who also believed in magic. On this particular Friday, Alora had her feet tucked up under her in the chair, her glass balanced on the armrest, looking out at the yard in the comfortable quiet of someone who isn't searching for anything right now. The kind of quiet that you can only be in with someone you genuinely trust. She looked at me. "Are you happy?" she asked. I considered it. Not performing the consideration, actually thinking about it, the way the question deserved. "Terrifyingly so," I said. She smiled. The real one, the quick, slightly crooked one that had surprised even her at a charity gala 7 years ago and had been surprising me ever since. "Good answer," she said. "I thought so," I said. She looked back at the yard. "I'm getting there," she said. "I wanted you to know that. I'm not all the way there yet, but I'm getting there." "I know," I said. "Don't rush me," she said, but she was smiling when she said it. "I'm not going anywhere," I said. "Take your time. I want to be honest with you about something." Because the version of this story that ends with a kitchen breakthrough and 6 months of seamless happiness would be a clean story, a satisfying one. But it wouldn't be the true one. There were weeks when I worked too much. Not as badly as before. Nothing like the 18-hour days of the years that cost me everything. But enough that Alora would get quiet in a specific way, a way I'd learned to recognize. And I'd have to stop and ask myself what I was choosing and whether I was choosing it consciously. Sometimes I was. Sometimes I wasn't. Both required honest conversation afterward, the kind we were getting better at having without either of us retreating. Alora still got scared sometimes, not often, and never without recovering. But there were moments when something I said or didn't say, some repetition of an old pattern she'd been trained to watch for, would move through her face like weather. And I'd see it, and I wouldn't explain it away or argue against it. I'd just stay. Because staying was the only real language she could trust yet, and that was fair. Indy had nightmares. Not every night. Not most nights. But occasionally she'd wake up in the dark and call out, and it was always the same dream in its emotional shape, if not its details. She was somewhere alone and couldn't find Alora. The content changed, but the fear was consistent. The fear of being left. We couldn't fix that with a conversation or a promise. It was going to resolve over time, through the accumulation of mornings where Alora was still there, of Tuesdays where I still showed up, of Saturdays that kept happening the way Saturdays had started to happen, reliably, deliberately, with the specific permanence of things that have been chosen and keep being chosen. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. And every day, the three of us chose each other through it. I had the ring. I'd had it for 3 weeks, which felt simultaneously very long and not long enough. It was simple. Alora was not a woman who wanted something that announced itself from across the room. She wanted something real, something made to last, something chosen with actual attention rather than impressive expense. I had taken longer than 3 weeks to find it, if I'm being honest. I'd been thinking about it since somewhere around the 4th Saturday. Indy knew. I have no idea how she found out, because I had been extremely careful. But Indy had an understanding of the emotional temperature of any room she was in that went well. Beyond her 4 years, and she had looked at me one afternoon with knowing eyes and said, completely out of nowhere, "Are you going to ask Mama something important?" I had said, "What makes you ask that?" She had said, "You look like you're thinking very hard about something." I told her I was planning a surprise. She had nodded, with the gravity of someone accepting an important responsibility. "I won't tell," she said. She had, in the 2 weeks since, come extremely close to telling approximately 4 times, each time redirecting herself at the last possible moment with the effortful determination of someone fighting their own instincts. Alora had noticed her being unusually careful about something, and was smiling more. Not because she knew. I didn't think she knew. But because the feeling in the house had shifted into something anticipatory, the way air shifts before something good. The right moment would come. I wasn't going to force it. Some things are better when you let them arrive in their own time, and I had spent enough of my life trying to control timing to know when to let go of it. That Friday evening, after date night, after Alora had gone inside to check on Indy, I stood in the backyard for a few minutes alone. In the corner, Indy's fairy garden was doing what it always did, existing in its specific, deliberate wildness, small stones arranged in patterns only she fully understood. A collection of objects that had been deemed important enough to keep there, a paper flag she'd made and staked in the ground, because every good garden, she had told me, needed a flag. Fireflies had started coming out. Not many, just a few, testing the dark the way stars do, a few at a time. They moved through the garden in slow, unhurried arcs, and I stood watching them and thinking about a man who had stood in a glass tower 42 floors up and believed that the view from up there was the best view available to him. I heard the back door open. Alora came out and stood beside me, and we watched the fireflies together without saying anything. From inside, faintly, we could hear Indy talking in her sleep, not distressed, just narrating something, the way she did. Probably Gerald. Gerald was always developing. Alora looked at me. I looked back. No words needed. That was the thing I'd had to learn. That the most important things between two people who actually know each other don't always require language. Sometimes they live entirely in the looking. The fireflies moved through the fairy garden. Inside, Indy narrated quietly. The September air was cool and clean, and the night was going nowhere in a hurry. This wasn't the life I had planned. It wasn't the empire I thought I was building when I was 29 years old, making promises to a man in a hospital bed. It wasn't the impressive, controlled, externally perfect existence I had spent a decade constructing. It was better, so much better that comparison felt inadequate. Because I had finally understood, not intellectually, not as a business insight, but in the bones-deep way that only lived experience can teach you. That you can have all the power in the world and stand at the top of everything you've built and still be completely, utterly empty. And that a kitchen on a Tuesday morning, a 4-year-old who calls you daddy, and a woman who is slowly, bravely choosing to trust you again, that is everything. That is the whole thing. Without love, you have nothing. With it, you have everything that matters. I want to talk to you directly for a moment. Not as Calloway telling you what happened next or setting up the following scene or building toward the moment where something shifts. I want to step out of the story for just a little while and talk to you the way you talk to someone when you've been through something and come out the other side of it, and you want them to have the parts that actually matter. Not just the events, but what the events were trying to teach. Because I spent a long time being impressive. I mean, that genuinely. By most measurable standards, I was impressive. I took a company that my father had built to a certain size and I grew it significantly. I made decisions that people in business publications wrote about. I sat in rooms where the conversations shaped industries, and I was rarely the least important person in those rooms. I wore the kind of suits that cost enough to make a statement, and I drove the kind of car that made a statement before you even got to the suit. And I was empty. Not in a way I could have named while I was inside it. That's the thing about a certain kind of emptiness. It doesn't feel like emptiness. It feels like focus. It feels like drive. It feels like you're the kind of person who has simply chosen a particular path and is committed to it, and all the discomfort along the way is just the cost of ambition, and you've accepted that cost, and you're fine. You are not fine. I know that now, because I have something to compare it to. I know what it feels like to stand in a glass tower at 42 floors with a harbor view and feel nothing but the absence of something. And I know what it feels like to stand in a backyard watching fireflies with a woman I love and a child asleep inside and feel so full you don't have language for it. Those two things are not comparable. I built $1 billion enterprise, and I sat at the center of it every day. And there was not one morning I woke up and thought, this is enough. Not one. Because the achievement was real, but it was hollow. And hollowness doesn't fill itself by expanding. It just becomes a bigger hollow. The connection is the thing. The actual present daily connection to people who know you. Not the version of you that presents well in boardrooms, but the actual you. The one who doesn't always have the answer. The one who makes mistakes and has to come back and say so. The one who cries in a kitchen because a 4-year-old asked if she could call you daddy. That version of you is the only one worth building a life around. Here's the thing nobody told me, and that I wish someone had, because it would have saved an enormous amount of pain. Fear doesn't look like fear when you're high functioning. Fear, for a person who has been trained to perform competence, looks like focus, looks like discipline, looks like the reasonable decision to prioritize the things you can control and table the things you can't. It wears a very convincing disguise, and because the disguise looks like strength, everyone around you, including yourself, tends to accept it at face value. I was so afraid of not being enough that I became nothing to the person who mattered most. Read that again, because I mean it exactly as I said it. Not that I became less than I should have been. Not that I fell slightly short. I became nothing. An absence. A gap in the shape of a husband. A person who occupied the same physical space as a marriage without actually being present in it. Because being present, really present, emotionally available, willing to be seen as uncertain and imperfect and working through it, required a kind of courage I'd convinced myself I didn't need. I was good at the professional version of courage. The version that takes calculated risks with money and markets and business decisions. That kind of courage I had in abundance. The other kind, the kind that lets you sit with someone you love and say, I don't know if I'm doing this right, and I'm scared I'm going to get it wrong. And I need you to know that, and I need you anyway. That kind I had run from so consistently and so convincingly that I didn't even know I was running. The fear of failure made me guarantee the failure. And if you hear nothing else from this story, hear that. Because it's not unique to me. I see it in people all the time. People who are brilliant and capable and deeply afraid of the one thing that can't be managed or quantified or optimized. Intimacy. Showing up fully, without the armor, and trusting that the people who love you can handle the unmanaged version. They can. They want to. But you have to let them. Let me tell you what it actually cost to come back. Not financially. Not professionally. Those things were straightforward. I understood how to navigate those. What it cost in the internal currency that actually matters. It cost me my certainty. I had to walk into Alora's world without a plan for the outcome, without being able to guarantee anything, without the ability to structure the situation in a way that reduced my exposure. I had to show up, not knowing if it would work, and keep showing up, not knowing if it would work, and accept that this was what trying actually looked like, not the confident, optimized version of it, but the genuine article, which is messy and unguaranteed, and requires you to be wrong out loud sometimes. I had to admit I was wrong. Specifically, explicitly, without softening it with context or redirecting toward what I'd been trying to do. I was wrong. What I chose cost the people I loved something real. And I had to say that and sit in it and not immediately reach for the next thing. I had to let go of control. Let Indy lead me to a fountain and make a wish for something happy. Let Elora set the pace. Let the Saturdays be whatever they needed to be, instead of managing them toward a predetermined outcome. Let a promise to a 4-year-old be the most important commitment on my calendar. And I had to show up, even when I didn't know if it was working. Week after week. Not because I could see where it was going, but because the alternative, not showing up, was something I was no longer willing to choose. That is what a second chance actually costs. Not a grand gesture, not a single dramatic moment of change. The daily, unglamorous, ongoing practice of being different from who you were. And the humility to understand that the people you hurt get to decide the pace, not you. I had always understood love as something that existed, something present or absent on or off, there or gone. I understand it differently now. Love is not a state. It's a practice. It's the Tuesday pancakes and the shelf you fix because someone mentioned it was unstable. It's the Friday porch and the stolen first pancake and choosing to stay in the conversation when the conversation is uncomfortable. It's the promise made in a parking lot to a 4-year-old and the subsequent Tuesday and the one after that of honoring it. It's not about the grand gesture. I know that sounds counterintuitive because the grand gesture is what we're trained to watch for, the dramatic declaration, the sweeping moment, the thing that makes a good story. And yes, there are moments in a life that carry more weight than others. The fountain wish, the kitchen floor, the fireflies. But those moments land the way they do because of everything surrounding them, because of the small, unremarkable, daily decisions that built the ground they stand on. The Saturdays, the pancakes. The "I'm not going anywhere" said not once, but consistently, over and over, in every small choice that either confirmed it or didn't. Love is what you do on the Tuesdays. On the ordinary mornings, when nobody is watching, and there's no dramatic stakes, and it would be easy to coast, to phone it in, to tell yourself that showing up in the big moments is enough. It's not. The Tuesdays are where love lives. The mundane, repeating, accumulating Tuesdays that stack into a life. Elora taught me that by living it. Indy taught me that by requiring it. And I am a better person for having finally understood it. And then there's Indy. I want to end here because she is where this story ends for me. Not because she fixed everything. Not because she was a vehicle for my growth in some tidy narrative way, but because she reminded me of things I had known once and buried under years of ambition and armor and carefully managed distance. Hugs, help. She told me that in a farmer's market, with her face pressed against my knee, on a day when I had no idea what I was doing. She said it as a fact. The same way she said the fountain was magic. The same way she said orange was brave. She wasn't being poetic. She was being accurate. Hugs, help. Magic is real. Orange is brave. These are not childish things. They are true things, delivered without self-consciousness by someone who hadn't yet learned that the world expects you to be more complicated than the truth. She reminded me that love doesn't have to be complicated, that showing up is not a sophisticated act. It is simply the decision to be there, that a wish made at a fountain with a penny in your hand can be the most honest thing you've done all week. That trust, once given by someone who has reason not to give it, is the most extraordinary gift available in this life. She looked at me, this small, serious, perceptive person, and she decided I was worth keeping. Before I had proven it, before I had earned it, by any reasonable measure. She looked at me and extended something, and that extension cost her something real given what she'd already learned about people who leave, and she gave it anyway. I have been trying to be worthy of it every day since. I don't always get it right. I am a work in progress, and I will be for the rest of my life. But I am a work in progress who is doing the work in the right kitchen, with the right people, on the right Tuesdays. And that makes all the difference. If this story meant something to you today, if something in it landed somewhere that needed to hear it, I want you to do 3 things for me. 1, hit that like button right now. 2, subscribe, because this is a community and there's more coming that you don't want to miss. 3, share this with someone who needs to be reminded that it is never too late to choose differently. Drop a comment below and tell me, what is one thing you are going to choose differently after hearing this story? I read every single one. My name is Callaway Harrington. I built an empire. I lost everything that mattered. And I found it again, in a farmer's market on a Saturday morning, in a woman's cautious second look, in a little girl's laugh and an orange flower and a fountain wish for something happy. This is my story. And if you're listening, maybe it's yours too.